Ladies and gentlemen, 2024 is drawing to a close. The final chapter of this year is upon us. And if you felt the weight of disappointment, missed opportunities, or regrets, I want you to listen closely. God has a message for you today. A message of restoration, of hope, and of His divine timing. I know some of you might feel like you've wasted time, like the years have passed by in a blur of struggles and setbacks. Perhaps you've wondered, what happened to my dreams? Why hasn't God opened the doors I've been praying for? You fought battles, faced failures, endured losses, and at times it may have felt like the years were slipping away without purpose. But hear me now, I'm telling you this with full confidence. God is about to restore what you thought was lost. He's about to redeem every moment, every mistake, every year you thought was wasted. December 2024 will be the turning point, the moment when God begins to make things right, not because you earned it, but because of His grace and His plan for your life. Let me make this clear. God doesn't work on our timetable. His ways are higher, His thoughts deeper. What you see is wasted time. God sees His preparation. He sees the lessons you've learned, the strength you've gained, the wisdom you've acquired. You may have felt like you were just spinning your wheels, but behind the scenes, God was setting things up, positioning you for the breakthrough that's coming. I know it's hard sometimes to see it, but let me remind you, there's no such thing as wasted time in the hands of the Almighty. Every year, every season, every struggle has a purpose. It's all part of His divine plan. And the good news, God is a God of restoration. He can take the broken pieces of your life, the things you thought would never be whole again, and He can turn them into something even better than before. The Bible says in Joel 2:25, I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten. That promise is not just for some people, it's for you. You may feel like you've lost years, but I'm telling you, God is going to give you back more than you ever thought possible. This December, God is going to do something that will shake the foundations of your life. Your faith, your family, your career, your relationships, whatever it is, God will restore it. You may have been walking through a season of drought, but I'm telling you, your rain is coming. God will flood your life with His blessings. He will open doors that no man can close, and He will make a way when there seems to be no way. But here's the catch: when God restores, He doesn't just give you back what you lost. No, He's going to give you back more peace, more joy, more purpose, more success, more of His presence than you've ever known before. This is your season of abundance. This is your moment of restoration. God's timing is perfect. It's a phrase we hear often in Christian circles, but do we truly understand its depth and significance in our lives? We live in a world that thrives on instant gratification. We've become accustomed to quick results, whether it's in our work, our relationships, or our desires. We want what we want when we want it. The idea of waiting, of trusting that something good will come in its own time, feels foreign in a world that seems to move at the speed of light. But God's timing is different. It operates on a completely different level, one that transcends our human understanding. When we look at the story of Abraham and Sarah in the Bible, we see this truth in action. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, yet for years he and Sarah struggled with infertility. Abraham was well beyond the age of fathering children, and Sarah too had passed the age of childbirth. In the natural realm, there was no way for them to have a child. And yet, God promised them a son. It's easy to imagine how they might have felt impatience, doubt, frustration. God, you promised, but it's not happening on our time. Why the wait? Why the delay? And yet, in Genesis 21:2, we see that the Lord visited Sarah as He had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as He had spoken. God's timing was perfect. He didn't forget the promise. He wasn't late. It just wasn't the right time until that moment. And when Isaac was born, it was a testimony of God's faithfulness and perfect timing. For us, it can be difficult to grasp this concept. How many times have we prayed for something, believed for something, and waited for something, only to see it not come to pass in the way we imagine or within the time frame we want it. We wonder, why is God taking so long? Doesn't he care? Doesn't he see my need? But this is where we must learn to trust in the sovereignty of God. His understanding is far beyond ours, and his purpose is bigger than any of our immediate desires or limited perspective. God's timing is not bound by the constraints of time that we experience. He exists outside of time, and he sees the bigger picture, past, present, and future. We, however, are limited to living in the present and can only see what's directly in front of us. So when we pray for something, we often want immediate answers, not realizing that God may be preparing us, refining us, or aligning circumstances in ways we cannot yet comprehend. One of the most important lessons in trusting God's timing is understanding that delay is not denial. Just because something has not happened yet does not mean it will never happen. God has a purpose for the timing of everything in our lives. There are moments when he delays an answer because he's working behind the scenes, putting things in place. Maybe there's something we need to learn in the waiting. Perhaps there are people or situations he is arranging to make the outcome even more beautiful or impactful than we ever imagined. When we examine the life of Joseph, we see a striking example of how God's timing works. Joseph's life seemed to be filled with setbacks. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, wrongfully imprisoned, and faced years of hardship. Yet throughout his trials, God had a plan. Joseph couldn't see it at the time, but his struggles were all leading to one moment when he would be elevated to a position of power, second only to Pharaoh. In that moment, Joseph was able to save his family from famine and fulfill the greater purpose that God had for him. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph himself says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." Joseph could see now that everything in his life had led to this appointed moment. This teaches us that when things don't make sense, when life feels like it's falling apart, we can trust that God is still working behind the scenes. His timing is not our timing, but it is perfect. We might think the doors are closing, but God might be waiting for the right moment to open them wide. We might think we've missed our chance, but in reality, God's plan is unfolding exactly as it should. His timing is perfect even when we can't see it. The Bible is full of stories of people who had to trust in God's timing. From Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt to David being anointed as king long before he actually took the throne, we see that God's timing is not always aligned with our expectations. But when God's timing is at work, it produces results that we could never have imagined on our own. Consider the story of Jesus, who in the Gospels often tells his disciples that his time has not yet come. In John 7:6, he says, "My time has not yet come." Even when his disciples urged him to reveal himself publicly, Jesus knew that the moment for his full revelation and sacrifice had not yet arrived. God's plan for salvation was unfolding exactly as it should, but it had to happen in God's time. And when that time came, it was perfect. Jesus' death on the cross brought redemption to the world, and his resurrection brought hope to all. In our own lives, we may face moments where we don't understand why things aren't happening the way we want them to. We might pray fervently, believe with all our hearts, and do everything right, yet still see nothing change. But in those moments, we must hold on to the truth that God's timing is perfect. He is never early, never late. He is always right on time. We may not understand the delays, but we can trust that they are part of a greater plan. Waiting on God's timing doesn't mean doing nothing. It means trusting him while you continue to move forward in faith. It means being obedient, staying patient, and holding on to his promises even when everything around you seems uncertain. It means knowing that while you wait, God is working in ways that are beyond your understanding. His delays are not meant to harm you, but to prepare you for what's coming. He's developing your character, building your strength, and aligning the pieces of your life to create something far greater than you can imagine. In the end, we must remember that God's timing isn't just about getting what we want when we want it. It's about trusting that he knows what is best for us and that he is always working things out for our good. We may not always understand his ways, but we can rest in the assurance that his timing is perfect. And his plans are always for our benefit. God's timing is not bound by our expectations, but it will always be right. Every delay, every detour, every moment of waiting is part of the process that leads us to something greater than we could ever have imagined. So when life doesn't go according to your timeline, trust in the one who controls time and know that his timing is perfect. Restoration is coming. This is a truth that many of us need to hear, especially when we find ourselves in seasons of loss, struggle, or disappointment. Life can sometimes feel like a never-ending cycle of setbacks and challenges, leaving us wondering if things will ever be made right again. But God has a promise for each one of us, a promise of restoration. When everything seems lost, when the dreams we once held dear feel like they're slipping through our fingers, we need to hold on to the truth that God is in the business of restoration. He doesn't just restore what was once there, he makes it even better than before. In the Bible, we see time and time again that God is a God of restoration. One of the most beautiful examples of this is found in the story of Job. Job was a man who had everything, wealth, family, health, until everything was taken from him. His livestock, his wealth, his children, and his health all disappeared in a series of devastating events. Job sat in the ashes of his life in deep sorrow and confusion, asking the age-old question, why? Why did this happen? Why was everything taken from him? Job questioned, he lamented, and he wrestled with the loss of everything he once held dear. Yet in the midst of his suffering, Job never lost his faith in God. He cried out in his pain, but he also recognized that God was sovereign. And even though he didn't understand what was happening, he trusted that God would bring him through it. And God did. By the end of the book, we see that God restored Job's fortunes, giving him twice as much as he had before. Job was blessed with more wealth, a new family, and a new sense of peace and purpose. God didn't just give back what was lost, he gave back more. He restored Job in ways that only God could. This is a picture of the kind of restoration that God offers us. It's not just about getting back what we've lost, it's about experiencing something even greater than what we had before. God's restoration is not limited to material things or outward circumstances. Sometimes the greatest restoration he offers us is emotional, spiritual, or relational. When we experience the loss of a loved one, a broken relationship, or a shattered dream, it can feel like we've lost a part of ourselves. But God, in his infinite mercy, is able to restore those broken pieces and make us whole again. In Joel 2:25, God promises, I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten. This is a powerful promise, especially when we feel like the years have been wasted or destroyed. In the context of the people of Israel, this was a promise of restoration after a season of devastation caused by locusts, which had destroyed their crops and livelihoods. But God, in his mercy, was going to restore what had been taken from them. He was going to bring them back to a place of abundance. This promise applies to us as well. No matter what has been taken from us, no matter how many years we've lost, God promises to restore those years. His restoration doesn't just fix what's broken, it replenishes what's been lost, sometimes even more abundantly than before. For many of us, the idea of restoration can be hard to grasp. We may have lost relationships, dreams, or opportunities that seem irreparable. We look back on the years that have passed and wonder if we will ever be able to get back what we once had. The pain of loss can cloud our vision, and it's easy to feel like we're stuck in a cycle of brokenness. But we must remember that God specializes in making things whole again. He is not limited by the damage that has been done. He doesn't look at the mess and say, this is beyond repair. No, God sees what we can't see. He sees the potential for new life, new hope, and new beginnings. He is the God who takes what is broken and makes it beautiful. There's a story in the Gospels where Jesus heals a blind man, and the disciples ask him why the man was born blind. They wanted to know if it was because of his sin or his parents' sin. But Jesus responds by saying that this man was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. John 9:3. In other words, Jesus allowed the man's blindness so that God's power and glory could be revealed through his restoration. Sometimes the pain and hardship we face are part of God's plan to display his glory through our restoration. The process may not make sense in the moment, but we can trust that God has a purpose, and his restoration will be a testimony of his power and goodness. When God restores us, it often requires a process. Restoration doesn't always happen overnight. It's a journey, and there may be setbacks along the way. There may be moments when we feel like we're not making progress or when the pain of the past seems to resurface. But we must remember that God is faithful and he is always working, even when we can't see it. Restoration requires patience and trust. It requires us to believe that God is still in control, even when things seem uncertain. We must surrender our timelines and expectations to him, knowing that his ways are higher and his plans are good. There may also be times when we need to take practical steps in the process of restoration. God often uses people, circumstances, and opportunities to bring about restoration in our lives. We might need to seek forgiveness, rebuild relationships, or take steps toward healing. God's restoration isn't just about a magic fix, it's about transformation. He restores us in a way that makes us stronger, more resilient, and more dependent on him. He teaches us through the process, refining us and shaping us into the people he created us to be. One of the most beautiful aspects of God's restoration is that it's not just for us. When God restores us, he often uses our story to bring restoration to others. Our testimony of his faithfulness and goodness can become a beacon of hope for those who are also struggling. When we experience restoration, we are in a unique position to share that hope with others who are facing similar challenges. Our journey of healing can be a powerful example of God's ability to restore, and it can inspire others to believe that their restoration is also coming. Restoration is coming, but we must learn to trust in God's timing. It may not happen when we want it to, and it may not happen in the way we expect. But one thing is certain: God is faithful. He sees our pain, he understands our struggles, and he promises to restore what has been lost. Whether it's our relationships, our health, our dreams, or our hope, God is in the business of restoration. He is making all things new, and his restoration is always worth the wait. We can hold on to the promise that no matter how much we've lost, God will make it right in his perfect time. Restoration is coming, and it's going to be more than we ever dreamed possible. Restoration is coming. This is a powerful truth that we must embrace, especially when life has knocked us down, when we've endured hardship, and when the weight of loss feels overwhelming. Too often, we find ourselves in seasons where everything seems to be falling apart. The dreams we once had, the relationships we once treasured, the opportunities we thought were ahead of us all seem to slip through our fingers. We look back, and it feels like years have been wasted, like time has been lost. Yet, in the midst of our struggles, there is a promise we can cling to. God is in the business of restoration. Restoration means bringing something back to its original state, fixing what is broken, and renewing what has been lost. But God's idea of restoration is not just about returning things to how they were. When God restores, he does not merely patch things up. He makes things better than they were before. His restoration is not about just repairing the cracks, it's about completely transforming our brokenness into something new and beautiful. When we experience true restoration, we are renewed in ways that go far beyond our own understanding. Throughout the Bible, we see the theme of restoration woven into the lives of many individuals. One of the clearest examples of restoration is found in the life of Job. Job was a man who had everything: wealth, family, health, and security. Yet in a moment, everything was taken from him. His livestock, his wealth, his children, all were gone. His health was destroyed, and he was left in a state of profound sorrow and despair. Job's life had been completely shattered, and in his pain, he questioned everything. He questioned the purpose of his suffering, the fairness of his loss, and even God's intentions toward him. But in the end, Job's faith and trust in God remained. And God responded to Job's faithfulness by restoring him not just to the place he was before, but by giving him twice as much. God did not just return Job's wealth and family, he multiplied it. The restoration Job experienced was more than what he had before. It was abundant, full, and overflowing. In the same way, God promises to restore the things we have lost. Whether it is our relationships, our dreams, our peace, or our sense of purpose, God is capable of bringing them back into our lives in a way that exceeds our expectations. In Joel 2:25, God declares, "I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten." This promise was given to the Israelites who had suffered devastation from locusts that had destroyed their crops and livelihood. Yet, in the midst of their ruin, God made a promise he would restore what had been lost. The people of Israel had suffered greatly, but God's restoration was coming, and it would be abundant. This promise extends to us as well. No matter how much time we feel we've wasted or lost, God has the ability to redeem and restore those years. We may look at the scars in our lives and believe that the damage is too great, that the hurt is too deep, and that the losses are irreplaceable. But God's restorative power knows no bounds. He does not just heal the surface wounds, he goes deep into our hearts and restores the brokenness that others cannot see. When we experience loss, it can feel like a part of us is lost forever. We wonder if we'll ever be whole again, if we'll ever be able to move on, or if we'll ever find joy again. But in the hands of God, nothing is beyond restoration. He takes what's broken and makes it beautiful. He takes what's been torn apart and weaves it together into something more magnificent than we could ever imagine. The restoration God offers is not always immediate, and it's not always easy. In fact, the process of restoration can often be uncomfortable. It's tempting to want a quick fix when we are hurting. We want to bypass the pain and skip ahead to the part where everything is healed. But restoration often requires patience. It requires us to trust God in the waiting, to believe that he is working behind the scenes even when we can't see the results yet. In the waiting, God is doing something in us. He is refining us, strengthening our faith, and preparing us for the fullness of his restoration. It's easy to lose hope when the restoration doesn't come as quickly as we'd like, but we must remember that God's timing is perfect. When the time is right, his restoration will come, and it will be worth the wait. Sometimes restoration involves change. God doesn't just want to restore us to where we were before. He wants to take us beyond that place. He wants to take the lessons we've learned in our pain and use them to create something greater. This kind of restoration often involves growth and transformation. We may not return to the same person we were before the loss, but we will be a better version of ourselves, refined by the trials we faced. God's restoration doesn't just return us to what was, it leads us into something greater than we had before. We see this theme of transformation and restoration in the story of Ruth. Ruth, a widow, had lost everything: her husband, her family, and her security. She had no reason to hope. And yet, in her faithfulness and trust in God, she experienced a remarkable restoration. Ruth found a new husband, Boaz, who not only redeemed her, but provided for her in ways she never imagined. Through this new marriage, Ruth became part of the lineage of David and ultimately part of the lineage of Jesus. Her restoration was not just personal, it was part of God's larger plan for the world. Ruth's story reminds us that God's restoration can also have a ripple effect, touching not just our own lives, but the lives of others as well. Restoration, at its core, is about God's ability to take what is lost, broken, or damaged and make it new. It's about his power to heal, renew, and transform. It's about his grace that covers our mistakes, his mercy that redeems our failures, and his love that overcomes every obstacle. When we feel like we've lost everything, when it feels like nothing can be fixed, we can take comfort in the fact that God is still in the business of restoration. No matter how much we've lost, how much time we feel has been wasted, or how deep the pain may be, God can and will restore it. As we wait for God's restoration, we must continue to trust in his promises. He is faithful, and he will fulfill his word. Even in the midst of loss, we can trust that God's plans for us are still good. His restorative work is not just about returning us to what we had before, it's about creating something even greater. Restoration is coming. It may not look the way we expect, and it may not come as quickly as we want, but we can be assured that God's restorative power is at work in our lives, and he will bring us to a place of wholeness and peace that we never thought possible. There are moments in life when everything seems lost. It feels as though we are stuck in a pit, surrounded by darkness, unable to move forward. We experience pain, disappointment, and frustration, and wonder if things will ever improve. It's in these moments that we need to remember one of the most powerful truths of all: God is a God of restoration. When life brings devastation, God brings restoration. He takes what is broken, shattered, or lost, and in his perfect timing, restores it to something even greater than before. It's easy to focus on what we've lost, whether it's a dream, a relationship, or a season of our lives. We can become so consumed by the emptiness we feel, the unanswered prayers, and the unmet expectations that we fail to see the possibility of restoration. But the truth is that God is always working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. He is a God who is actively restoring us, even when we feel like we are beyond repair. One of the most beautiful examples of this can be found in the story of the Israelites in the Old Testament. The people of Israel had endured years of suffering, wandering in the desert and being separated from their promised land. They had experienced loss and hardship, and many had given up hope of ever being restored. But God, in his mercy and grace, promised them that he would restore them. In Joel 2:25, he says, "I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten." This was a promise of restoration after years of devastation and loss. The Israelites had endured a famine of sorts, their land destroyed by locusts, and their lives disrupted. Yet God's promise was clear: he would restore what had been lost. He would give them back the years that seemed wasted, and he would make everything new again. This is not just a promise for the Israelites, it is a promise for each of us. No matter what we've lost, no matter how much time we feel we've wasted, God has the ability to restore it. His restoration is not just about returning things to the way they were. It's about making them better than they were before. God doesn't just return us to our former state, he takes us beyond what we thought was possible. His restoration is always greater than we could imagine. The process of restoration can be challenging. It often involves a period of waiting, a time when we feel like nothing is happening, and we may even begin to doubt if restoration will ever come. But it's in these moments of waiting that our faith is tested and strengthened. God uses the waiting period to prepare us for the restoration that is coming. During the waiting, he teaches us to trust in his timing and his ways, which are always perfect. The waiting is not wasted. It is a time of growth, refinement, and preparation for what is to come. In addition to the waiting, restoration often requires a change in perspective. Sometimes we are so focused on what we've lost that we fail to see what God is doing in the present. We may be looking backward, longing for what once was, while God is calling us to look forward to what he is about to do. Restoration doesn't always look like we expect it to, and it doesn't always happen in the way we imagine. But God's restoration is always greater than our expectations. It's important that we don't limit God by our own understanding of what restoration should look like. We must allow God to work in his own way, knowing that his plan is always better than ours. One of the most important aspects of restoration is healing. When we experience loss, whether it's the loss of a loved one, a relationship, a dream, or something else, it leaves a wound. And healing takes time. God doesn't rush the healing process. He walks with us through it, gently restoring what has been broken. Sometimes healing involves confronting pain that we'd rather avoid. It requires us to acknowledge the hurt, to grieve the loss, and to allow God to mend our broken hearts. Restoration is not just about fixing what's external, it's about healing what's internal, bringing peace to our hearts and minds. In the process of restoration, God also brings us to a place of wholeness. We may feel fractured, fragmented, and incomplete after a loss. But God, in his love and grace, takes the broken pieces of our lives and fits them back together. He makes us whole again. This process of wholeness involves more than just a return to normal. It involves transformation. God doesn't just restore us to who we were, he restores us to who we were always meant to be. When we are restored, we become stronger, more resilient, and more dependent on him. The restoration process refines us, making us better equipped to handle future challenges and to live out the purpose he has for us. God's restoration also has the power to redeem the years that we feel have been wasted. We may look at our past and see time that we feel was lost or misused, but God has the ability to redeem even the wasted years. He can take what was once a period of despair and turn it into a season of growth and purpose. We may not always understand how God works, but we can trust that He will use everything, even the mistakes and failures of our past, for His glory and for our good. No time is wasted in God's economy. He redeems every moment. And He has the power to restore the years that we thought were gone forever. There is also a sense of joy that comes with restoration. When God restores us, it's not just about returning things to their previous state, it's about bringing joy, peace, and fulfillment into our lives. Restoration is about experiencing a fullness of life that we never thought possible. When we look back at what God has done, we can't help but marvel at His goodness. The joy that comes with restoration is a reflection of God's faithfulness to us. Even though we may have endured trials, even though we may have faced heartache when we experience God's restoration, it fills our hearts with joy and gratitude. One of the most powerful aspects of restoration is that it often impacts others. When we are restored, others are impacted by our testimony. The healing and restoration we experience become a witness to those around us of God's power and faithfulness. Our story of restoration can encourage others who are going through their own struggles, reminding them that God is able to restore what has been lost in their lives as well. Restoration is not just for us, it's a gift that we can share with others, pointing them to the hope that we have in God. God is a God of restoration. And no matter what we've lost, He has the ability to make it right again. It's not always easy and it's not always quick, but it is always worth it. God is working in ways we cannot see, restoring what has been broken and bringing healing to the hurting. He takes the things we thought were lost forever and turns them into something new, something beautiful, and something greater than we could ever imagine. Even when it seems like all is lost, we can trust that God is always at work, restoring and redeeming every part of our lives. In life, there are moments when everything seems to go wrong. The dreams we once had seem to fade away, relationships break down, opportunities slip through our fingers, and we find ourselves in a place of loss and despair. It is in these times when everything seems shattered that we need to remember one of the most powerful promises in Scripture. God is a restorer. He has the ability to take the broken pieces of our lives and make them whole again. He can turn our devastation into restoration. What we thought was lost forever, He can redeem. This is not a distant promise, it is a present reality, one that we can cling to when everything else around us is crumbling. The idea of restoration is deeply embedded in the story of the Bible. Throughout the Scriptures, we see examples of individuals and nations experiencing loss, but also finding hope in the restoration that only God can bring. One of the most powerful stories of restoration is the story of the prodigal son. This young man left his father's house, took his inheritance, and squandered it all on reckless living. He hit rock bottom, found himself feeding pigs, and realized how far he had fallen. But in that moment, when he was at his lowest, he decided to return to his father's house. The father, seeing him from a distance, ran to him with open arms, embracing him and restoring him to his place as a son. The father didn't just welcome him back as a servant, he celebrated his return with a feast, saying, "For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Luke 15:24. This story is a picture of the grace and restoration that God offers to each one of us. No matter how far we've fallen, no matter how many mistakes we've made, God is always ready to restore us, to bring us back to the place of honor and blessing. Restoration, however, is not always an immediate process. It often involves a journey, a path that we must walk through pain, loss, and sometimes confusion. It can be hard to trust in the process, especially when we don't understand what God is doing. But this journey of restoration is where God does some of His most important work in our lives. It's in the waiting that our faith is deepened, our character is refined, and our dependence on God grows. We may not always see the end result, but we can trust that God is working all things together for our good. His restoration is not just about fixing the brokenness in our lives, it's about shaping us into the people He created us to be. Through the process, He works in us and through us, teaching us lessons that we could never learn without walking through the fire. Sometimes we may wonder why we need restoration at all. Why can't we just go on with our lives as they were before the pain, before the loss? But the reality is that restoration is not just about going back to where we were. God's restoration is about moving forward into something better. It's about taking the pain and brokenness of our past and using it to build a stronger, more vibrant future. God doesn't just restore us to what we were before. He restores us to something greater than we could have ever imagined. In the book of Isaiah, God speaks about his restorative work in a beautiful way. He says, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it?" Isaiah 43:19. God is always doing a new thing in our lives. His restoration is not about returning to the past, but about moving forward into the future that he has for us. There is also a powerful truth in the fact that God's restoration often involves a return to purpose. When we experience loss, it can feel like we've lost our way, like the dreams we once had are no longer possible. We may feel like we've wasted time, that we're too old, too broken, or too far gone to pursue our purpose again. But God is a restorer of purpose. He takes the seasons of our lives where we feel lost and he breathes new life into them. He restores our sense of purpose and calls us to something greater than we ever imagined. The story of Joseph in the Bible is a perfect example of this. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and thrown into prison. He endured years of hardship and pain. But through it all, God was preparing him for the purpose he had for his life. In the end, Joseph became the second in command in Egypt, saving his family and the nation from famine. God didn't just restore Joseph's position, he restored his purpose. What seemed like years of wasted time were actually years of preparation for the greater plan God had for his life. In the same way, God can take the time we feel has been lost and use it to prepare us for something greater. He uses our struggles, our pain, and our waiting to shape us for the purpose he has for us. No time is wasted in God's economy. Even when we can't see it, God is using every season of our lives to shape us into the people he has called us to be. His restoration of our purpose often comes at a time when we least expect it. It often takes us to places we never imagined. One of the most significant aspects of restoration is healing. When we experience loss, we don't just need our circumstances to change, we need healing in our hearts. Pain, grief, and disappointment can leave deep wounds that take time to heal. But God is a healer. He doesn't just restore what we've lost, he restores our hearts. He takes the brokenness inside of us and in his perfect timing brings healing to the wounds that no one else can see. This healing doesn't always come in the way we expect. Sometimes it comes slowly through the quiet moments of prayer and reflection. Other times it comes through the support of others, through the community of believers who walk alongside us. But in all cases, God is faithful to heal the wounds that have been left by our losses. In the process of restoration, we also experience a deepening of our relationship with God. When we are in the midst of pain and loss, we often turn to God more fully, seeking his comfort and his presence in a way that we might not do when everything is going well. This closeness to God, this intimacy that is developed in the midst of our struggles, is one of the most beautiful aspects of restoration. It is in the broken places that we experience God's love in a deeper, more profound way. We learn to trust him more fully, to lean on him in ways that we never have before. God is not distant from our pain. He is near to the brokenhearted. He is with us in the fire, and through the fire, he brings us to a place of greater intimacy with him. Restoration also brings a sense of renewal. After experiencing loss or hardship, we often feel weary, exhausted, and drained. It's hard to imagine ever feeling strong or vibrant again. But God is a God who renews our strength. In Isaiah 40:31, we are reminded that those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. This promise is for those who are weary, for those who have experienced loss and pain. God promises to give us new strength, to restore our energy, and to help us rise up again. Restoration is not just about returning to what we were, it's about moving forward with renewed strength, with a fresh sense of purpose, and with a heart that is full of hope. Finally, God's restoration often involves a blessing that exceeds what we had before. When God restores, he doesn't just give us back what we've lost, he blesses us beyond measure. In the story of Job, after all of his suffering, God not only restored what he had lost, but he gave him double what he had before. Job's story reminds us that God's restoration is not just about replacing what was lost, it's about blessing us in ways that are even greater than what we had before. God's restoration is always better than what we could have imagined. His plans for us are always greater than our own. And when we experience his restoration, it is always abundant and overflowing. God is a restorer. No matter what we've lost, no matter how far we've fallen, he is always ready to restore us. His restoration brings healing, purpose, renewal, and blessings beyond what we could ever imagine. Through the process of restoration, God makes us whole again. Life can be overwhelming. We experience moments of joy, but we also face difficult times when it feels like nothing is going the way we hoped. Perhaps we've encountered a season of disappointment or failure, and the weight of it all makes it hard to imagine a way out. The future seems uncertain, and the past feels like a heavy burden we can't escape. But even in those moments, we must hold on to the powerful truth that God can restore us. He can bring us out of the darkness, heal the wounds, and bring new life where we thought there was only death. Restoration is one of the most powerful demonstrations of God's love and power, and it is available to everyone who trusts in his timing and his will. Restoration is often misunderstood. We may think of it as simply a return to what was lost, like an old piece of furniture being refurbished or an object being repaired to its former condition. While this is part of the process, God's restoration goes much deeper. It is not merely about returning to the way things were, it is about making things even better than they were before. God's restoration touches every part of our being, spiritual, emotional, and even physical, and transforms us into something new, something greater than we were before. When we experience loss or hardship, it can feel as if time is slipping away. We may think of the years we've lost, the opportunities missed, and the dreams that seem to be fading. But God promises that he can restore those years. In Joel 2:25, God says, I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten. This is a profound promise because it shows that God doesn't just redeem the things we lose in the present moment. He has the ability to redeem our past. He can take the years that feel wasted, the moments of regret, and the pain of our experiences and use them for his glory. When we trust in God's restoration, we begin to see how he uses every part of our journey every season, even the painful ones, to prepare us for something greater. The process of restoration often requires us to let go of the past. We may find ourselves holding on to the pain of the past, thinking that by doing so, we are honoring the memories of what we once had. But holding on to the past can keep us stuck in a place where we are unable to move forward. God doesn't want us to stay in a place of loss and regret. He calls us to release the past and trust him to heal the wounds it has left. This act of surrender is often one of the hardest parts of restoration. It requires faith that God is working in our lives, even when we can't see the full picture. We might not understand why certain things happen, but trusting God means believing that he will take what we've lost and make something beautiful out of it. It's important to note that restoration is not always immediate. We live in a world that expects quick fixes, immediate results, and fast answers. But God's restoration process doesn't always happen on our timeline. It can take time. Sometimes we might wonder if restoration is ever going to come. It can feel like we are stuck in a place of waiting, unable to move forward. But waiting is not wasted time. God uses the waiting seasons to build our faith, to refine us, and to prepare us for the fullness of what he has in store. While we wait, God is at work behind the scenes, orchestrating the restoration process in ways we may not see. He is preparing our hearts to receive the blessings he has promised. In the process of restoration, we also find that God often does more than we expect. He doesn't just fix things, he makes them better than they were before. Think about the story of Job. Job was a man who endured immense suffering. He lost his wealth, his family, and his health. He was in deep grief, questioning why everything had fallen apart. But in the end, God restored everything that Job had lost and more. Job's latter days were more blessed than his former days. God restored his fortunes, gave him a new family, and blessed him with even greater prosperity than before. God's restoration in Job's life didn't just return things to the way they were. It was a new beginning, a new chapter, one that was even more blessed than what came before. God's restoration works the same way in our lives. When we trust him with our losses, he doesn't just bring back what we lost, he brings something greater, something more meaningful. Restoration in God's hands often means growth and transformation. It means that we emerge from our struggle stronger, wiser, and more equipped to handle what comes next. We are never the same after experiencing God's restoration. The process of being restored refines us and prepares us for a future that is beyond our wildest expectations. This idea of restoration is also deeply tied to healing. Often, when we go through difficult seasons, we don't just need our circumstances to change, we need healing in our hearts. The pain we experience can leave deep scars. And those scars can affect the way we see the world, the way we relate to others, and even the way we relate to God. But God is a healer, and he desires to bring healing to the deepest parts of our hearts. The healing that comes through restoration isn't just about fixing the surface, it's about touching the places we've buried deep inside, the places where we may have been hurt the most. God, in his mercy, brings his healing touch to these areas, allowing us to experience true wholeness. Healing through restoration also involves forgiveness. Many times our wounds come from the actions of others, and carrying that hurt can prevent us from moving forward. Forgiveness is an essential part of restoration. It's not that forgiveness excuses the hurt or minimizes the pain, but forgiveness frees us from the bondage of resentment and bitterness. When we choose to forgive, we allow God to heal our hearts and restore us to a place of peace. Forgiveness opens the door for God's healing and for his restoration to work in our lives. It allows us to let go of the weight of anger, bitterness, and unforgiveness, and to embrace the peace and freedom that comes with restoration. Another powerful aspect of restoration is the renewal of hope. When we go through seasons of loss and struggle, it can be easy to lose hope. We may think that things will never change, that we are stuck in a cycle of defeat. But God is a God of hope, and he promises that he will restore our hope. In Romans 15:13, it says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." God doesn't just restore our circumstances, he restores our hope. He fills us with the kind of hope that doesn't fade with time or circumstances, but is anchored in his faithfulness. This hope gives us the strength to press forward, knowing that the best is yet to come. In the midst of restoration, we also find that God brings us into a deeper relationship with him. When everything is going well, it's easy to take our relationship with God for granted. But in the seasons of struggle, we are drawn closer to him. We lean on him more fully, seeking his guidance, his comfort, and his peace. This deeper intimacy with God is one of the greatest blessings that comes with restoration. We learn to trust him in ways we never had before, and we experience his love in a deeper, more profound way. Restoration is not just about what God does for us, it's about what he does in us. It is a process of transformation that touches every part of our lives. God uses our struggles, our losses, and our waiting to refine us, to heal us, and to prepare us for the future he has for us. His restoration is always more than we could imagine, and it always brings us closer to him. When we trust him with our pain, he restores us and brings new life where we once thought there was only death. Through his restoration, we emerge stronger, more hopeful, and more in tune with his purpose for our lives. We experience not just a return to what was lost, but a transformation into something greater than we were before. Sometimes in the midst of our greatest struggles, we feel as though we are in a season where there is no way out. Our problems feel insurmountable, and we may even feel like our dreams and hopes have been buried beneath the weight of disappointment and loss. In those moments, it's easy to forget the power of God's timing and to lose sight of the fact that he is always at work, even when we can't see it. But one of the most powerful truths in Scripture is that God's timing is perfect. It is in his perfect timing that we experience restoration, transformation, and breakthrough. God's timing may not always align with our own, but it is always right, and it is always for our good. Trusting God's timing is an essential part of our journey toward restoration. At times, we may feel impatient as we wait for the answers we seek or the breakthrough we long for. We may ask ourselves why things aren't changing, why our prayers seem to go unanswered, or why it feels like God is taking his time. But God's timing is never arbitrary. It is purposeful, and it is filled with intention. We often want things to happen quickly, according to our plans and timelines. We want the healing, the restoration, or the breakthrough to come right now, but God knows exactly when the right moment is. He knows when we are ready for what he has in store. His timing works not only to fulfill his promises, but also to prepare us for what is to come. Waiting on God is one of the most challenging aspects of faith. It requires patience, trust, and surrender. Waiting doesn't mean inactivity, nor does it mean that God has forgotten us. It simply means that God is working in us, refining us, and preparing us for what he has for us. There is a profound lesson in the waiting. We may not understand it, but God is building character in us during this time. He is teaching us to rely on his strength, to trust his will, and to hold on to his promises. Even when we don't see the evidence of what he's doing, we can be confident that he is working behind the scenes. In Isaiah 55:9, God reminds us that his ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He sees the bigger picture, and his timing is always in alignment with that greater plan. One of the most significant aspects of trusting God's timing is understanding that it is often a process. We may have a clear vision of what we want to see happen, but God knows that what we are asking for needs preparation. Often, he allows us to go through seasons of growth and transformation before he answers our prayers. This process isn't about God withholding from us, but rather about preparing us for the fullness of his blessing. The process refines us, strengthens our faith, and positions us to receive what God has for us. It is in these times of waiting that we learn to depend on him more fully, and we begin to recognize that our hope is not in the timing of the answer, but in the faithfulness of the one who promises to deliver. The story of Abraham and Sarah in the Bible offers a powerful example of God's perfect timing. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, yet for years, Abraham and his wife Sarah were unable to conceive a child. They waited for decades, and as time went on, it seemed more and more unlikely that God's promise would come to pass. Sarah even tried to take matters into her own hands by offering her servant Hagar to Abraham, hoping to fulfill God's promise in her own way. But God had a better plan, and in his perfect timing, Sarah gave birth to Isaac, the child of promise. Abraham and Sarah's story is a reminder that God's promises are not dependent on our timing, but on his. When God makes a promise, he will fulfill it, just not always when or how we expect. His timing is perfect, and it is worth the wait. Waiting on God's timing also requires a shift in perspective. When we are in the midst of waiting, it is easy to focus solely on what we don't have or what hasn't yet happened. We may become frustrated, disillusioned, or even discouraged. But in those moments, we are called to focus not just on the promise, but on the process. God's timing is not only about when things happen, it's also about the lessons we learn in the waiting. It's in those times of waiting that God draws us closer to him, teaches us patience, and reveals things in our hearts that need to be transformed. Waiting is not a passive experience. It is an active process where we are continually being shaped and prepared for what lies ahead. Sometimes God's perfect timing can feel like a delay, but we must remember that a delay is not a denial. God is not slow in fulfilling his promises, as some might think. 2 Peter 3:9 reminds us that the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. When we feel like things are delayed or like answers aren't coming quickly enough, we can be sure that God is working in his perfect time. He is not caught off guard by our circumstances. He is not unaware of our struggles. Instead, he is orchestrating every detail of our lives with perfect precision. His timing is never wrong. Even when it feels like it, he is preparing us for the moment when everything will fall into place. Another key aspect of trusting God's timing is surrendering control. When we wait for God to move, we are forced to confront our own desire for control. We like to have a plan, to know when things will happen, and to be in charge of the outcome. But surrendering to God's timing means letting go of our own plans and trusting that He knows what is best. It requires humility to admit that we cannot control everything. Surrendering control allows God to take the lead and to work in ways that we might not even understand. When we release our grip on the situation, we make space for God to work freely in our lives. This is often where true restoration takes place. Throughout the Bible, we see countless examples of individuals who had to wait for God's perfect timing. Joseph, for example, was given a dream as a young man that he would one day rule over his brothers, but the path to that dream was long and difficult. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. For years, Joseph waited, and during that waiting, God was working in his heart, preparing him for the position of authority that would one day save his family and entire nation. Joseph's story is a powerful reminder that God's timing is always intentional. It may not happen when we expect, but when it does, it will be exactly what we need. There is a deep peace that comes when we learn to trust in God's timing. We no longer need to strive to force things to happen or to worry about whether God will come through. When we trust His timing, we can rest in the knowledge that He is in control. We can live with the confidence that He is working all things together for our good, even when we don't see it. His timing may be different from our own, but it is always perfect. When we trust in God's timing, we learn to wait with expectation, knowing that when the moment comes, He will fulfill His promises and restore what we've lost. Our waiting is never in vain, and God's timing is always worth the wait. When we face the difficulties of life, it is easy to feel like we are alone, like no one understands what we are going through. We may wrestle with feelings of abandonment, thinking that God has forgotten us or is far removed from our pain. But one of the most comforting truths we can hold on to is that God is always with us, even in the darkest moments. He is not distant or indifferent to our suffering. Rather, He is near to the brokenhearted and intimately aware of our struggles. In the midst of life's trials, God is present. He is with us through every storm, every challenge, and every season of uncertainty. And it is through His presence that we find the strength to endure and the hope to keep going. The Bible is filled with assurances of God's presence. From the beginning of creation to the end of time, God has promised never to leave us. In Deuteronomy 31:6, He tells His people, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." This promise is not just for the Israelites, it is for us today as well. No matter what we face, we can take comfort in the fact that God is with us. His presence is not dependent on our circumstances, and it is not limited by the intensity of our struggles. His presence is constant, unchanging, and ever present. When everything else seems uncertain, we can find security in the fact that God is always by our side. In our pain, it is often easy to feel that God is absent, but He is still with us, even when we don't feel Him. Feelings of abandonment can be strong, and we may wonder why God isn't intervening or why He seems silent in our suffering. But even in silence, God is working. He is present in ways we may not immediately perceive, and He is actively involved in our lives, even when we don't see the full picture. The Psalms are full of cries to God for help and expressions of feeling abandoned, but they also remind us that God is our refuge and strength, even when we can't see Him working. In Psalm 46:1, it says, "God is our refuge and strength, and ever-present help in trouble." God is with us even when we feel alone. And He is working in ways that we may not fully understand. God's presence in our lives is also a source of peace. In John 14:27, Jesus tells His disciples, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." This peace is not the absence of trouble or the absence of pain. It is the peace that comes from knowing that God is with us in the midst of our difficulties. This peace is not dependent on our external circumstances, but is rooted in the unshakable reality that God is with us. Even in the midst of life's most challenging seasons, we can experience a peace that transcends our understanding because God is present and He is the source of that peace. When we experience hardship, it can feel like our world is falling apart, but God's presence is the anchor that keeps us grounded. It is through His presence that we find the strength to keep moving forward. We are not called to face our struggles alone. We are called to lean on Him. In Isaiah 41:10, God promises, "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." God does not leave us to fight our battles by ourselves. He is with us, and He will strengthen us in our weakness. He will hold us up when we cannot stand on our own. His presence is our source of strength, and when we rely on Him, we can find the courage to face anything that comes our way. In addition to being with us in our struggles, God's presence also brings hope. When we are in a difficult season, it can feel like there is no way out. We may begin to lose hope, thinking that things will never get better. But God's presence always brings hope. In Romans 15:13, Paul prays, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in Him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." Hope is not just wishful thinking, it is the confident expectation that God is at work and that He will fulfill His promises. When we are anchored in God's presence, we are reminded that He is faithful to bring us through every difficulty. His presence fills us with hope, even in the darkest moments. God's presence is also a reminder of His love. When we are going through tough times, it can be easy to question God's love for us. We may wonder why He is allowing us to go through certain trials or why He hasn't answered our prayers yet. But God's presence is a constant reminder that He loves us. In Romans 8:38-39, Paul writes, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Nothing can separate us from God's love, not our struggles, not our failures, and not our pain. His love is unshakable, and it is always with us. When we experience God's presence, we are reminded that we are deeply loved, and that love sustains us through every trial. The presence of God is not just a comfort for us personally, it is also a call to action. When we experience the love, peace, and strength of God's presence, we are called to share that presence with the world around us. We are called to be a light to others who are struggling, to offer the same comfort that we have received from God. In Matthew 5:14-16, Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." As we experience the presence of God, we are called to reflect that presence to others. When we share the love and comfort we have received, we become instruments of God's presence in the lives of those around us. Ultimately, the most powerful aspect of God's presence is that it changes us. We are not meant to stay the same after encountering God. His presence transforms us, making us more like Him. In 2 Corinthians 3:18, Paul writes, "And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into His image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." As we spend time in God's presence, we are shaped and molded into the image of Christ. We become more compassionate, more patient, more loving, and more like the Savior who is with us. His presence is not just a comfort in times of struggle, it is a catalyst for our transformation. God's presence is the ultimate source of our strength, comfort, hope, love, and transformation. It is through His presence that we find everything we need to navigate life's challenges and to grow in our faith. When we learn to rely on His presence, we are never truly alone. We can face anything, knowing that God is with us, working in us and through us. As we reflect on all that we've discussed, we must come to the powerful realization that God's presence, His perfect timing, and his unwavering promises are the foundation of our hope and strength. The journey through life is not always easy, and there are seasons of hardship, pain, and uncertainty that may make us feel lost and overwhelmed. Yet even in the midst of these trials, God's presence remains constant. He is always with us, and he is working on our behalf, even when we cannot see or understand his actions. It is in the dark moments when everything seems uncertain that God's light shines the brightest. He has not forgotten us, and he will not leave us to walk this path alone. We must learn to trust in the timing of God, even when it does not align with our expectations. Too often we seek to rush things, to make things happen according to our own will, but God's timing is always perfect. It is in his perfect timing that he restores what we have lost, heals what is broken, and brings us into the fullness of his plan. Waiting is never easy, and the journey may seem long, but the reward is worth it. As we surrender our desires, plans, and timeline to God, we open ourselves to the blessings he has in store. We can be confident that when the time is right, he will fulfill every promise, restore every broken piece, and make all things new. Throughout our lives, we may face seasons of struggle, seasons where we feel like we are running out of time or that our years have been wasted. But God promises that he will restore what was lost. The years we thought were wasted, the time we spent in pain or confusion, are not beyond the reach of God's restoration. He is a God who redeems time, who brings healing to every part of our lives. There is nothing that has been lost that he cannot restore. As we trust in his presence and his timing, we can hold on to the hope that no matter where we are in our journey, God is at work, bringing restoration and transformation to our lives. We must also remember that it is in our weakness that God's strength is most evident. When we feel like we have nothing left to give, when we are at the end of ourselves, that is when God's power is made perfect in us. It is through his strength that we can endure, persevere, and rise above the challenges we face. We are not called to walk this journey alone. And when we feel weak, God comes alongside us, lifting us up and carrying us through. We must embrace our dependence on him, recognizing that it is only through his strength that we can navigate life's challenges. As we move forward, we must also remember the importance of community. God has not called us to walk this journey in isolation. He has placed us in a body of believers, a community of people who are there to encourage, support, and uplift us. In times of trial, it is the support of others that often strengthens our faith and reminds us of the goodness of God. We are called to be the hands and feet of Jesus to those around us, to extend his love and comfort to others, just as he has done for us. When we walk in community, we reflect the heart of God and fulfill the purpose he has for our lives. Through every trial, through every season, God is working in us, shaping us, and preparing us for the future he has planned. The difficulties we face are not meaningless. They are opportunities for growth, opportunities to lean more deeply into his presence, and opportunities to be transformed into the people he created us to be. It is in the hard moments that we often experience the most profound change. God uses the trials to refine us, to mold us into his image, and to equip us for the calling he has placed on our lives. As we look to the future, we must hold fast to the hope that God's promises are yes and amen. The restoration he offers is not just a promise for the distant future, it is something he is working in us right now. Even in the midst of our struggles, he is restoring our hearts, our minds, and our lives. There is nothing too broken for him to heal, nothing too lost for him to restore. We can walk forward with confidence, knowing that no matter what we face, God is with us. His timing is perfect, and his promises are unshakable. In this journey, we must never forget that God is not only a God of restoration, but also a God of transformation. The story of our lives is not one that is defined by the things we have lost or the pain we have endured. Our story is defined by the power of God's presence, his work in our lives, and the hope that he offers. He is making us into something new, something beautiful, and something powerful for his glory. Each day is an opportunity to grow in faith, to trust in his timing, and to experience the fullness of his presence. And so we can face the future with a deep sense of hope, knowing that our God is always with us, that his perfect timing will bring restoration and breakthrough, and that he is transforming us every step of the way. No matter what we face, we can be confident that we are never alone. God is with us, and he is faithful to fulfill every promise. As we trust in his timing, rely on his presence, and embrace his transformation, we will see the beauty of his work unfold in our lives. What may have seemed like wasted years, what may have seemed like setbacks, are now the very things that God will use to bring about his purpose in us. So we move forward with faith, with hope, and with the assurance that God is restoring all that has been lost, redeeming the time, and preparing us for the incredible future he has planned. So don't let the end of this year pass by in despair. Don't let the devil tell you that it's too late, that you've missed your shot. God is not done with you. He's just getting started. The best years of your life are ahead of you. And as you stand on the threshold of 2025, you will look back on December 2024 and say, that was the moment everything changed. God is about to restore all your wasted years. Trust in him. Keep your faith strong. Your time is coming. Thank you.